Michael Sutcliffe is my name, and I've been instructed by 1DV to tell you a bit about myself. So I was born in Durban, which is where we are. It's called Ethekwini, Greater Durban. We'll tell you a little bit about that later. In South Africa, and I spent my schooling here and then did a master's MSc degree at the university, it was called then Natal, and then did a PhD at Ohio State University. And partly because of the white regime in South Africa that obviously was until 1990 in control of the politics of this country, didn't really understand the history of our country that very well through that schooling of mine. When I got to university, that's when my consciousness started, but only when I went to the United States and studied that I was really able to understand both my country but the world as a whole. I had a really good Marxist advisor, and I've remained a Marxist ever since. So the prism under which I look at the world is the way in which Marx in the 1870s looked at the world then, where you have this dominant mode of production that is really defining in structural terms what's happening in the world. However, it's not defining everything. There are clearly social relations that emerge. In some cases, traditional leadership is kept, but it's reconfigured to suit the interests of capitalism broadly. So I then came back, and that's, I suppose, when my real politics started. I worked at the University of Natal, and we had a graduate program in planning, and that graduate program was the only program in the country that had a master's level of planning, which was also allowed black students to come into that program. So we put our foot down there, even though the state at that stage was saying it was a white university and you can't have that. And we went on protest and said that we would deal with it. So at least half of our classes were women and half were black South Africans. And very proud of that because many of those have become great leaders themselves. That's what I did by day. By night, we had launched as the Liberation Movement the United Democratic Front, which brought together a wide range of organizations, of student organizations, women, youth, to fight the apartheid state. And it was known as the United Democratic Front. And in a sense, it was part of the liberation movement's 4 strategies to fight apartheid. The one being establishment of an army in Mkhonto weSizwe, but it was a political army. You could not fight in that army until you had a good understanding of political economy and why you needed to pick up guns to fight. We built an underground, which meant we infiltrated state institutions. We built an international campaign, and people throughout the world, from the Soviet Union then to the United States, so whether they were capitalist or communist countries, supported us in our struggle for liberation. And then lastly, the internal mobilization, mobilizing students, youth, women. Anyway, and that's really what I suppose since 1980 I've been part of, and I've learnt and struggled and fought and been a bit crazy and done things since then. So in that period, for about 10 years, I was teaching students by day, but trying to train them in our program, because it was really a radical planning program, to try and teach them to be what I think Francis Fox Piven spoke about in the 1980s, to become guerrillas in the bureaucracy. In other words, to train people to, when they get into the bureaucracy, how do you change the world, but in ways in which you know that the regime was a racist regime. It was a sexist regime. It was a regime that was against any progressive person, even white people. So how do you build people and make sure that when they get in there, they could deal with it? Of course, in the 1980s, then it became very tough because they introduced a set of states of emergency. Many of those young people then that we trained as planners then couldn't get jobs because they were known to be linked to us. And so we built non-governmental organizations. Built Environment Support Group as one of those. We had an education training center, had an administrative training center. So we were trying to prepare ourselves for the post-apartheid period. And then together with the ANC, who were leading the strategies, we then built a set of what have now become our policies post-1990. Late 1990s, then there were negotiations. Mandela was released. And then early 1990s, we then had to build the constitution. And because we were one of the last countries to fight against colonial and imperialist oppression, we decided that we must do those things ourselves. We must negotiate ourselves, we must write our constitution ourselves, but we must learn from best practice around the world. So when you read our constitution, it doesn't just talk about political rights. In other words, the right to speak, the right to organize, the right to associate. It talks about economic rights, that poor people have rights. It speaks about environmental rights. The environment can't speak, but it speaks. Because if you destroy the environment now, future generations will be taught a lesson by that environment. So we said those are the sets of individual human rights that we must have that define our country. And I'm very proud of that, because when we look at the policies we then developed, we have a free basic service policy, which says every South African is entitled to 6 kilolitres of water a day for their household of clean water. And we've done our best to try and meet that. We said every South African is entitled to a certain amount of energy, because if children don't have access to electricity, or people are not cooking on the stove, there is trouble there. So we've introduced a whole set of policies that, interestingly, were almost the first in certainly the more capitalist world. It was unheard of that a government secures those rights. New York City today, for example, if you're poor, you're out, you're gone, finished, no one's interested in you. But that's a struggle. So we made some, I think, not mistakes necessarily. We built more houses than we focused on public transport. And the reality is that most black South Africans were dumped in locations that were uneconomic before. So now they're paying a lot for transport, or what they do is that during the week they might live in a shack area close to where they work, if they have work, or where they're seeking work, but they would still have a home elsewhere where they've got to travel to. So there are things like that that we're catching up, because we spent too much on, and it's not to say we shouldn't have spent money on housing, but because our priority was to build houses, and we built a few million houses for poor people where they've received those houses for free, we haven't focused enough on transport, public transport, and sorting that out. We know that health is a huge issue. So how do we create, we've got this imbalance in our country between the, let's call it the capitalist regime of private sector, where most workers belong to that, and most of the rich people belong to that. And that's where all the money is, all the science is, etc. And yet we've got to build a public service system. So we're trying to say, how do we combine the two and create a national health service there? So in each of those sectors, we still haven't got to the end of that, but we're dealing with it. I was then asked by Nelson Mandela, who was our president then, to chair something called the Demarcation Board, Municipal Demarcation Board. And so my job as chair of that, because we had apartheid institutions, so there was only white local government, there was no black local government, there was no other local government for the majority of people in our country, that then to redraw those boundaries. And because boundaries defined who you were, if you were a black person, you were far from economic opportunity. If you were a so-called Indian and coloured, who's also defined as black in that sense, you might be slightly closer to that. And then white people, of course, the irony was whites were richer, but they had less distance to travel to work. And those are things that you can't change overnight. So later on, I'll talk about spatial justice, I'll talk about spatial sustainability, I'll talk about spatial efficiency, because we then have taken those principles and said that's what should guide us as we undo what apartheid did, but rebuild a new kind, less discriminatory world that we have going forward there. And then I was asked after we'd completed those first set of boundaries, obviously they do get revised after that, and held the first democratic elections in local government, I was then asked to come and run the city of eThekwini. So for about 10 years, I was city manager of this city. It's had a budget in US dollar terms, probably about $2 to $3 billion, about 30,000 staff members across the city. But again, this disjuncture, because formerly black areas had never received basic services. They had to burn their rubbish. They had to, maybe some had access to electricity. Maybe some had access to water, or they'd have to walk maybe a kilometre or a mile in other terms to get water. So how do we, in a city like this, how do we make sure we're bringing access there? So while I was city manager, we built, over that 10-year period, we built over 150,000 houses for poor people, where they got them for free. We made sure that we went from only 1/3 of the city having access to water to being over 85% of the people having access directly to water. Same thing with energy. And that created its own problems, because once you've given people a house, then people's expectations then, and even the conditions of the house, you've got to now repair and maintain and deal with issues there. So it was a wonderful opportunity to be part of the city in that 10-year period. And after that second contract finished, I then moved out from the city, and now together with Sue Bannister, we run a consulting agency. We do some work internationally, so working with Palestinians, working with people in India, people across Africa, obviously. Ethiopia is the recent place in which we've been doing a bit of work. And then most of our work is in South Africa. How do we begin to make sure that we're hopefully taking some of the experience that we've had there to help both municipalities but also government itself? Because remember, it's only, as I mentioned to you earlier, we were the only university producing black planning students. And that was about 10 a year. The apartheid state was generating about a few hundred white planners to serve the apartheid state. Now, that's the kind of issues that take you time. They take generations before we can truly say we've got the kind of society, economically, socially, politically, environmentally, that is working for us. That you can't think of spatial justice unless you start by saying, let's talk about inequality, let's talk about unemployment, let's talk about poverty. And those are the three pillars on which our National Development Plan is built. But they're worldwide issues. Now, inequality, we often think of it as just income, but let's talk about assets first. Who owns the world? If you go to the United States, anything about 70% of the stocks on the US stock exchange are held by less than 10% of the people of the United States, of adults there, of families. And because most people have no sense, so when Trump talks about the stock exchanges doing wonderfully, who's benefiting? It's only the hugely rich and powerful. In our country, there's 6 families that have controlled much of the South African economy historically. And we've got to break that down. So first, just at an assets level, there's a massive disjuncture there. At an income level, it's even worse, that you have some people whose income you don't even know about. And as we saw under Trump, for example, all he did was continue to benefit the rich. And so there were corporations in the United States that never paid taxes. Trump himself, as the evidence shows, paid about $300 taxes, which is not even what a working class person in the United States pays. Now, throughout the world, the capitalist world, that's a similar situation. In South Africa, we still have that kind of situation where you'd have some people who are running corporates in our country that are earning $3 million a year equivalent, when a person like our president is earning probably $200,000. So you have this huge disjuncture still between, in terms of income inequality. When you look at health inequality, just look at the world right now, where you have the United States have more vaccines than they need for the whole population of the United States. You find that the 25 richest countries are controlling most of the vaccines for the world. Not only the vaccines, they're refusing to allow their licenses for those pharmaceutical corporations to be given to countries like South Africa, India, and others, so that they can begin to produce vaccines for COVID. So at a health point of view, at a big picture, you can see that, but at a local level, you can see it, where, you know, the irony of the terrible tragedy, it's not an irony, of COVID is it's exposed that in spite of a place like the United Kingdom, roughly the same size as South Africa, but having an unbelievable national health service, has twice as many people dying in the United Kingdom as here. And compared to the United States, again, many times more that have died in the United States in spite of the expenditure on health. And the main reason for that is that the health service is not there to make people well. The health service is there to make profit. If we take food, same thing. Levels of food security. You go to any shops and you'll find at the end of the day, they're dumping that food or making sure whatever spare food is now outdated is being eaten by people who are not people who could be buying that food. And the reason for that, in parts of our world, we literally are throwing away enough food that could be feeding those societies that you would get there. So when you get to the case of food security doesn't exist because, again, we've got a capitalist mode that is making sure that it doesn't deal with it there. If you look at access to legal services, you have a constitutional court in this country that focuses its effort on what are the rights that poor people should have. And I'm very proud of that. So there have been many judgments against the party that I come from in government, not the party itself, saying, sorry, you can't evict people from a house just because they put up their shack. You must go through due process there and deal with it. And because we don't want people to be thrown out in the street, there must be a process to deal with them afterwards. And that's good. Now, you'd never get that in the United States Supreme Court. They're about defending the rights of the rich, defending the rights of police officers against the people who are simply saying we want police officers to focus on safety, not to focus on violence and security. And those are the kind of things that we've got to talk about, because if we're talking about spatial justice, which I'll get to in a minute, the issue of inequality is fundamental. And two aspects of that inequality, particularly pertinent in our country. One of the first books I think I remember reading when I was fairly young that started me thinking about these issues of inequality was a book called Women Without Men. And it was about migrant workers who were talking about the community they came from in Rutu. And it's a rural area to the north of the city. It's about 250 kilometers from here. And the people living there were mainly women, the sick, the young, with no access to the basic social conditions that you expect, but yet their husbands were off in the city making money, trying to make money that they then bring back to them. So this idea of women without men, where you had whole communities of women who now were triply oppressed. They were black, they were women, they had no opportunity to get any kind of work in an area like that. Hugely unequal, where the state wasn't even paying to provide them something, the then apartheid state. Now, it was even worse for those men of theirs. They were in the cities living in what were called migrant worker hostels, and we still have some around the city here. And in those migrant worker hostels in those days, men could only drink beer that was made by the state, and it was called Bantu beer there. That was the name that it was given. And the profits that were made from that beer were then used to build those hostels. So black people themselves were systemically, basically building whatever the state had. The state wasn't giving them money. And indirectly, they were supporting the white communities because they would shop in shops owned by whites, primarily whites, maybe some, very few in this city, Indian-owned shops. But the rates, the property rates, property taxes paid from those shops were then used for white communities there. So when we talk of systemic racism, that's what we're talking about. Because a black person can't be racist. Because if you say that a black person's racist, it's not, a black person can have attitude, but they're not racist because racism is something that is systemic. It's something that's part of a society's, what that society is made up of. The United States is systemically racist. You know, no one can argue that it shouldn't even be a debate that people are talking about that because it is controlled by whites. The whole system is. Now, the same thing happens when it gets to gender, in the sense that women can't be sexist. And we've got to get that kind of language sorted out, because sexism is, again, a systemic issue. It's the way in which men have kept women from, if they're even able to enter the labor market, and that happened very relatively recently, they're not able to progress. And it's only now that we're hearing of those wonderful women who helped in getting NASA off its ground, who were black American women. And it's only now you start hearing about, yes, he was an assistant to Chris Barnard, who did the first human heart transplant in the world, and he was a technician, but it's only now. He was not necessarily the key person there, but he was a hugely important person in that team, because when you're doing a heart operation, it's not one person sitting there and dealing with everything. Now, when we deal with spatial inequality, it's not just that we're looking at gender and we're looking at race and we're looking at other aspects of inequality. We're actually talking about how does that unfold in space. And so if black people live in the poorest communities, furthest from places of work, they're going to spend longer on transport, they're going to spend longer to buy food and vegetables, they're not going to be able to get all those other nice social things. Usually they're not close to nice parks or recreational spaces. And so that creates what's called a spatial inequality. It means that parts of a city, parts of a region, parts of a state, or in the world context, you have that inequality that exists there, where some people are left to fend for themselves, to pay for themselves. And they're usually the poorest, the most unequal, and most discriminated against, and those who in fact are most unemployed or have to survive on unemployment there. So that's the first of the things that we said we've got to begin to overcome in our country, and I'll come back to it a little bit later. The second thing is that we have a spatially unsustainable world that we live in. So even if you go to Finland today, you will find that they are still have what are called peat farms that are bad for the atmosphere and take many, many, many years, sometimes decades, in order for those places to end up with an economy that is environmentally sustainable. So the second area of that spatial unsustainability that we've got to address then is why we say it's not just about justice. Justice is our number one, and that's about rights, giving people rights to the city, rights to do what they want to do, rights that we engage with issues. Because some people are just unconscious. They have a false consciousness about what racism is, what sexism is, what income inequality is. You know, they have this belief that, oh, no, if you're rich, you've made it. The question is, who helped you make it? How did you get your money? And that's why issues like corruption, etc., are so important for us to fight. The third issue is about spatial efficiency, because at the moment we have very inefficient systems. Ideally, everyone should be able to get access to public transport. You should only need to have your own motor car for recreational use, or maybe for people who want to live, let's call it in a more rural area. It's crazy that in cities that are fairly dense, you have very poor public transport. So when we talk of spatial efficiency, we're trying to make sure that that's the kind of society we're wanting to build.